Welcome everyone to the third week of UCC's virtual speakers series, Speaking of. My name's Matt Grimm, and I've got the pleasure today of welcoming you to this event, which is focused on Canadian diplomacy. Now, I'm the head of the economics department. I'm the senior house advisor for Mowbray's House, but most relevant for today, I'm the faculty advisor for the Model United Nations Club here at UCC. And in this role, I help train would-be diplomats to debate, negotiate, and hopefully help resolve some of this era's most pressing international issues. So this Speaking of series is really right up my alley, and I'm very excited to be here. Today, we're going to hear from our expert panel of speakers who hold positions of insight and influence at the United Nations, the Canadian Embassy to the United States, and the High Commission of Canada in Mozambique. They're going to be shedding light on some of the most urgent global issues affecting our everyday lives and our collective future. But before we get started, we wish to acknowledge this land we gather on today at Upper Canada College. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of many peoples, including the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and more recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to gather and learn on this land. So I'm going to start with a few housekeeping notes that I'd like to go through. So first, we love that Zoom allows us to see each other, even when we're not actually in person. So please feel free to turn on your camera so we can see you too. We encourage all of our guests to be actively engaged in the conversation, but we're encouraging it digitally. Please mute your microphone and use the chat function to ask questions throughout, and feel free to message the whole group or send your questions directly to our moderator. To help us identify you, change your screen name to include your full name and your class year, if applicable. And finally, this event is being recorded and shared on multiple channels for those who cannot attend. Now, without further ado, I'm honored to introduce Zhu Zhang from the class of 2015 as today's moderator. Zhu is currently doing his master's in international affairs at Columbia University. Prior to Columbia, he worked as an analyst at the United Nations Office for Project Services in their New York office to identify the social impact of investing opportunities in renewable energy, health, and transportation between Asia and Africa. Last summer, she worked at the National Development and Reform Commission of China as a summer associate and researched the Sustainable Development Coordination Initiative in Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei. This is a megalopolis with a population of 110 million people. Born in Hebei, Zhu served as the head of WED's House during his senior year at UCC. And now I'm going to present it over to Zhu. Zhu, thank you.
Thank you, Matt, for the warm welcome. I'm very honored to be part of this event and to share my enthusiasm for international relations with the UCC community. Thank you also to our speakers for taking time to be here with us today from across the globe. We have 3 fantastic UCC alumni participants who are currently representing Canada in 3 different cities around the world. First of all, I would like to welcome Hussein Lee from the class of 1999. Hussein is a political counselor at the Permanent Mission of Canada to the United Nations based in New York City. Welcome also to Lee Kin from the class of 1999. Lee is the Minister Counselor and Senior Trade Commissioner at the Embassy of Canada to the United States of America, and is currently working in Washington, D.C. And last, but certainly not least, welcome to Gavin Nardocio-Jones from the class of 2000. Gavin is the first Secretary, Political and Public Affairs at the High Commission of Canada to Mozambique. As we get into today's discussion, I would like to encourage you to ask questions along the way. Please use the chat function to post your questions and feel free to direct your conversation to a specific speaker. To start off our conversation, I would like to ask you to spend 1 to 2 minutes each briefly describing your role working for Canada abroad and what led you to a role in international affairs. Let's start with Hussein, Lee, and then Gavin.
Thanks, Zhu, and thanks, Matt, for the introduction as well as the land acknowledgement. I hadn't heard that UCC before, so really appreciated hearing that. So funny thing is, I can, as I reflected on this, I could tie back my current role to interest sparked back at UCC I was there for 11 years. I was a survivor back when I don't know if they still call it that, McHugh's in the end. But my favorite subject in IB was definitely economics under kind of one of Matt's predecessors. And my extended essay was on the Ismaili creed of Syria and Iran in the kind of late 900s, early 1000s, the assassins. And that love of kind of economics and Middle East issues continued in my career. So I went to Cornell University, did a double major in economics and Middle Eastern studies. Part of my time there, studied at the American University of Beirut in a semester abroad. After school, went to back to Toronto, worked in consulting for a while, didn't love it. So did my master's in the UK in development economics. After that, worked for the Aga Khan Development Network in Syria, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, and then back to Canada. Somewhere along the way, wrote the Foreign Service exam, and 2 years later, was told to come to Ottawa and join. So did that, and have been lucky to work first on Middle East issues, Israeli-Palestinian issues from Ottawa, then non-proliferation issues, and worked in Ramallah for 2 years in the West Bank, and back to Canada, and then I was in DC for 6 years at the embassy, and then Lee moved to town, so I had to get out of there, and it came down to New York, where I cover a lot of Asia issues, still do Israeli-Palestinian issues, as well as sanctions and counterterrorism. The other point I would add is hockey was also a big part of my life at UCC, and something that has connected me with communities wherever I went. Played, we had a street hockey league in Ramallah, played in hockey tournaments in the northern tip of Israel, ran our embassy hockey team in Washington, and have been in New York for about 6 months. And one of the first people I got connected with was an old boy who runs a hockey team here. So for any students or parents or alumni, keep that up, because you never know the connections it leads to as well.
Thank you, Hussein. And Lee, please.
Great. Thank you, Xu and Matt and everyone. Absolute pleasure to be here. I'll just say to Hussein, the hockey team here in DC has been on a losing streak ever since you've left, so we want you back. Really, I'm not trying to steal Hussein's story, and we should have coordinated, because a lot of my love for what I do today came from UCC as well. My experience also in economics class, I believe, was Mr. McVeigh. I'll be brief on it, but he used to bring in a shortwave radio and plug it at the front of the room, and we would listen to Chinese radio. I don't believe Mr. McVeigh spoke Chinese, nor did anyone in the class, but he basically did it to say, look, you haven't learned anything about Asia throughout your academic career. You need to start thinking about China and its up-and-coming nature and global politics and the economy and so on. And I realized that it was true. We hadn't learned much about Asia, and Canada has improved, but it has been a slow road to learning about the Asia acumen. And so that kind of tied me in. After leaving UCC, I began my university life at McGill very briefly, a Bachelor of Commerce with a focus in East Asia. But of course, as life does, a quick pivot after my first year in Montreal. I met an American girl, we eloped to Paris, and I somehow managed to convince McGill to let me defer for 3 years. We lived and worked in Paris for a year and then moved to Shanghai, where we opened a small business. We stayed there for a couple of years and then decided to sell the business, return to North America, and I finally finished that BCom degree while our first daughter was born. We then moved to Geneva. We did for a master's program in international relations, and also, it was nice to be back in Europe. We met life's plans once more. My wife was pregnant with our son, and so we received an offer to move to Ottawa and join the then Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. At that point, my wife and I realized that we wanted for our kids and for ourselves a road that really living everywhere and anywhere was possible. So we packed up and we did move to Ottawa and started our life in the Foreign Service. And 15 years later, we've done 3 postings in China. Beijing, our first posting was the energy lead. In Shanghai, I was the head of our foreign policy and diplomacy service. And then back to Beijing as senior trade commissioner. Our third child was born in Beijing, and then we decided, hey, time to move to the other side of the world, to the other connected diplomacy spectrum. And so we've been in Washington, D.C. at the embassy now for a couple years, just prior to the pandemic starting, and I'm Senior Trade Commissioner and Minister Counselor here, so very active. I guess, from my experience, the diplomatic career, like no other, does really offer, the kind of best laid plans aren't required, I'd say. And I think Hussein mentioned it as well. Really, the most rewarding experience entering into the Foreign Service is approaching it from a sense of risk taking, woven within a desire to live abroad, represent Canada. And it's truly been that. It's been fantastic, primarily focused on China and the US, but knowing that who knows what the future will bring for my family and for myself, it's been a great career, and we're looking forward to much more. We are eager to get back to Canada soon, so I expect you'll be seeing us around as well.
Thank you, Lee. What a story. I also went to McGill after UCC, but my story is far less interesting. Thank you, Lee. And now let's turn the mic to Gavin.
Thanks so much, Zhu, and all for being here. It's great to see some familiar faces and see some names in the chat, giving us a hard time already. Gavin Jones Howards, and I'll take a slightly different approach to this intro section, and I'll sort of do a quick career overview, but focus more on actually what I'm doing here in Mozambique, because that's often pulling back the curtain on the day-to-day. So after UCC, I went to the UK for university, and my first job was a part-time gig at the Quebec government office, of all things, during my master's. Springboarded to the High Commission on Trafalgar Square, where, as a locally engaged staff, I was able to get the college access to a couple memorable alumni events in London. Shout out to Jonathan Foster and Winnell, of course. It was from there that actually Hussein and I wrote the Foreign Service exams together. Happy to be at the High Commission. And then back to Ottawa, where Lee was firmly established as the college's best representative of foreign affairs. And after Ottawa, Dakar, LA, New York, and now in Maputo. And so just to give you a quick glimpse, so I'm currently the head of a very small, what we call the Foreign Policy and Diplomacy Unit, basically political and public affairs, at Canada's High Commission here in Mozambique. I also cover Malawi and Eswatini, formerly Swaziland. Quick pop quiz, put it in the chat. What's the difference between a embassy and a High Commission? Anyone? Anyone got that in the chat or want to come in? No? All right. Yes. Sunir's got it. British colony. Easy now, Simon. Easy. Yes, the Commonwealth is the answer. So if you're in a country, if you are Canada, part of the Commonwealth, in another Commonwealth country, you are a High Commission in each other's countries. There's all these different political and diplomacy terms. And I just thought, what does it mean to be covering these countries? Well, it's being responsible for everything that is deemed bilateral relations. So network building with the host government, international community, civil society, media, targeting stakeholders, advancing priorities, all those good things. And I know Lee and Hussein probably get this all the time. What does a diplomat do? What do you guys, what do you do every day? And it's hard to describe because every day is super different. But I'll just give you a quick rundown of what I did today. I wrote a note verbal to the government of Malawi about an upcoming trade mission. I accompanied my High Commissioner to a meeting with the head of Mozambique's official opposition party, an internal meeting about planning for Women's Month and what we're going to do in activities in social media. I had a meeting with my Norwegian counterpart to coordinate speeches for an event next week that we're supporting the UN Office for Drugs and Crime on an interagency training to combat illicit financial flows. And then I ended the day with an all-staff meeting about our latest vaccine booster arrivals and the refurbishment to the embassy. So, bureaucracy thrives, even here in Mozambique, but this is a typical day. So hope that was useful. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gavin. And thank you all for sharing your stories. As a young alumni who is planning to enter diplomacy in the future, you guys are definitely role models. So the next session, I have prepared some individualized questions. But before I throw those questions to our audience body, please throw your questions in the chat. And I'll be very ready to throw your questions to our panelists. So my first question is to Lee. Lee, in your role as Minister Consular and Senior Trade Commissioner at the Embassy of Canada to the United States, can you please describe what a typical day looks like in the Canadian Embassy in Washington? How do you spend your time, and what are some key deliverables in your position? Thank you.
Thanks, Xu. Well, really, I mean, unfortunately or unfortunately, there really aren't typical days at the embassy in DC, which is really what drew me to this business in the first place. The embassy is represented by nearly every Canadian government department and a number of provinces. And so in many ways, it is kind of a mini Ottawa, if you will, without the honking right now. So really any major issue impacting Canada is on the Cork board at 501 Pennsylvania Avenue, where we're located. For those of you who have not been, our embassy is located across the street from the Capitol building and really is recognized as the prime location for engagement with key US interlocutors, House members, staff. So we do have unparalleled access in many ways. You know, currently, for example, a team's working on addressing trade and market access challenges, which I'll speak to in a second, representing Canada with US interlocutors on geopolitical issues, Ukraine, managing border issues, and of course, working with officials and stakeholders on COVID. Really in the North American context, I mean, please apologize, I'm going to run off on a bit of a diatribe now, but I did want to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the Canada-US relationship and understanding that the nexus between global economic competition and what we call strategic economic cooperation has never been more important. Before we do discuss the current situation, I did also want to take a moment to reflect on these past 24 months or so, the impacts on our bilateral relationship with the US. It's obviously an understatement now to say that we've experienced a period of significant instability, uncertainty, loss, and change, you know, here in the US and Canada and across the globe. But since the beginning of the pandemic, our countries have collaborated very closely as we do, maintaining that two-way flow of goods, particularly critical inputs and supplies across our borders related to COVID. And that's been a big focus for us at the embassy, as you can imagine. COVID's also been really a critical and important component of engagement with the Biden administration in the early days. But I am here to talk about trade, so I would like to speak briefly, and I'll speak candidly as much as I can about the administration's approach as we've seen it to trade. I think that would be of value in the discourse, and I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. You know, we were all, or many of us, were optimistic about entering this new type of trade relationship following the last US election. We saw this Biden trade policy that touched on many objectives and values shared by Canada and other like-minded partners. For example, you know, a worker-centric approach, enhancing supply chain security, influenced, of course, by lessons learned from COVID, climate action and sustainable growth, inclusive economic growth, and strong enforcement, especially on China. You know, again, these shared values, the message that was coming out of the new administration, keen on rebuilding relationships with key allies while rejuvenating global governance. This was all very encouraging. However, to be frank, as we pass this one-year mark since the president's inauguration, there is growing frustration among those allies that the rhetoric has not translated to concrete actions. A few examples, of course, the approach on 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, the continuation of the Trump tariffs and phase one deal with China, as well as the reluctance to pursue any new free trade agreements, signals a few considerations I did want to note. You know, the first being that the administration talks a lot about needing new trade tools and maximizing the use of existing tools. That emphasis on tools rather than rules and trade liberalization has been noted by many of us. The second, of course, and this is critically important now, is domestic politics is by far the most important concern for the administration. It's imperative that we recognize that domestic reality in the US, notably in the lead up to the midterm elections this year, which I'm sure we'll all be watching very carefully. But Canada continues to work aggressively and to engage with key interlocutors and convey its concerns. And the embassy and the ambassador and our team play a pretty important role in that. Our messaging is very clear. You know, economic recovery efforts that limit the use of inputs from Canada negatively affect cross-border supply chains, it distorts investment, it adds layers of bureaucracy, and it does actually threaten US jobs while driving up the cost of important public infrastructure. So this is a bit of the role that we play, is getting that message everywhere and anywhere across the street, as I mentioned, at Capitol Hill and various other places. But again, also noting that having said all this, while we're working to mitigate those impacts and address market access, the reality is it's important to recognize that trade is in fact growing, and significant opportunities continue to exist for Canadian businesses in our largest and closest market. You know, sharing that $1 trillion trade and investment relationship, $2 billion a day crossing the border. The US it'll always be our most important trading partner, and often the first export market for many Canadian businesses, no matter the size and no matter the scope of those businesses. So really, despite global challenges, everything we're facing, we're talking about today, the uncertainty and the instability, Canada's relationship with the US, it does endure, it's resilient, it's interdependent, it's multifaceted. And I think it's just important for all of us to understand and manage the challenges while ensuring that we continue to maximize those opportunities and the relationship for our team every day. And so that's really what our focus is right now, but happy to answer questions as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Lee. And we do have one follow-up question from our audience, Dave Phelan. The question is, what are the most in focus products or natural resources for Canada and the US to develop domestically to reduce dependence on and vulnerability to China? And which of those are most viable over the next 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. If we had hours, I'd be, and I would be happy to talk to whoever asked that question. I don't know, maybe it was Kip Shaw, year of 99. But I would say, you know, semiconductors is obviously what we're looking at. The global shortage of semiconductors, and specific in the North American context, it's a huge challenge. You know, we're trying to adapt our automotive industry, looking at EV vehicles, we're looking at autonomous vehicles, and without that secure supply of semiconductors and everything upstream from that, so critical minerals, the important inputs on batteries, these are areas where there's significant investment already going into that, and there's an impetus from both the US government, the Canadian government, and other like-minded to address that challenge. As she mentioned, you know, I spent 10 years in China and before that as well. I did watch what was called then rare earth mineral development and the challenges at that time. That's only been exacerbated, and I think specifically around COVID. So those are areas that are absolutely top priority. Beyond that, I think, you know, and I'm happy to talk about it, but I think infrastructure itself, we've seen what's called the IIJA, the one real bill, tangible bill that that President Biden has been able to pass so far, investing about $1.75 billion into infrastructure. The reality is that infrastructure domestically here is old. It needs an update. And while there are some protectionist concerns, and we're monitoring that and working with companies closely, the labor shortages, supply chain issues are going to create opportunities for Canadian companies, for exporters, for specifically nascent technologies that can help develop those that have essentially been stagnant for the past 50 years. So a lot of opportunity there as well. And there are challenges in Canada too. I mean, we have to look at this realistically. Labor shortages as well as supply chains are impacting us too. So addressing that from a North American perspective is critical.
Thank you, Lee. It seems like everyone is very interested about your focus on China and also your current role in the United States, but be conscious of with our time, we'll save it for the end. And Gavin, now a question to you. So Gavin, working for Canada internationally has meant living in a number of cities abroad, including London, Dakar, LA, and New York. Having recently relocated to a new role at the High Commission of Canada to Mozambique in Maputo. I understand that you recently undertook the challenge of learning Portuguese prior to taking on that role. Can you please speak to some other unique challenges faced by Canadians working in international relations and how you have been successful in your career by meeting those challenges head on?
Muito obrigado, Ju. Boa tarde, boa noite a todos. Yes, I was just saying thank you very much and good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, bom dia. Yeah, I'll start with the Portuguese thing because it's pretty incredible actually, and it is a real privilege that the department, Global Affairs Canada, has had this policy in place for a long time, whether going to China like Lee or to Lebanon or wherever, a third language is imperative, recognizing that English and French as official languages of Canada are an imperative for all foreign service officers. We need to have a certain level of bilingualism. That third language, they do give full-time training. So last year, I did nearly 900 hours of full-time Portuguese training at full salary on Zoom They were also, my spouse was also able to join me for those 900 hours. So if you can imagine doing a online language course with your significant other for a whole year during the pandemic, it was fun. Yeah. Only a couple hiccups. But no, and that allowed her to, and this gets to some of what what the question was asking about, Ju, to face the challenges of moving to a new country, totally different culture, totally different language more easily, and continue with her career, find a new career opportunity. And I think that's one of the things that I wanted to touch on as part of the question, is that when Canada takes the time to invest in its employees and increase the level of intercultural effectiveness, it really reflects well on us as a country. Not all countries do that. My French colleague got 3 weeks. My Norwegian colleague got 3 months. Like when they arrive, their ability to make connections, not just with the people in your neighborhood, but with the host government that you're trying to engage with, is reduced compared to ours. But I think, as I was saying about my spouse and moving around the world is fun, it's exciting, but it's tough. You leave careers behind, you leave friends behind, family. You have to, for anyone who's moved house recently, it's a giant pain and it's stressful. And living in LA is just as moving to LA is just as challenging to adjust as moving to Dakar. Sure, it's very different in terms of challenges, but I discovered living in the US on posting there and getting a little bit of PTSD from Lee's talk about Section 232 tariffs and that negotiation, which I went through as well. That as Canadians, we do have to bring our own values and skills and languages and perceptions with us wherever we go, and we're proud of those, but it's challenging to adjust. And I think recognizing that is an important step. And then recognizing the perception of Canadians abroad. So as we represent our country and our government, having a better sense of our own self and place in the world is really important. I think Canadians do that well. I was talking with my Norwegian colleague today, like I mentioned, and like Norway, like Canada, and New Zealand maybe, who are smaller countries next to a big neighbor, who have to fight for their voice to be heard. We're a G7 country. We punch above our weight internationally. We do share a lot of values with big allies around the world, but at the same time, we have to recognize our limitations and know that sometimes we might be a bit naive when trying to enter into, areas of intervention where we may not have whether it's financial, people, or policy backing. I don't want to get into specifics, but we need to approach issues with humility is what I'm saying. And I think Canadians do that well. And that's when we actually do get a chance to engage on an equal footing with partners around the world, because we are honest a lot of the time. And that goes for our companies and people as well. I think that's a strategic advantage of Canadians. Diversity is strength. It's not just a political slogan. I really think that whether it's the members of the Foreign Service who represent Canada that I work with come from all backgrounds, religions, previous careers, training, and it's an asset. And I'm really proud of that. I think as well, we are civil servants as well, and I think I often reflect on the very interesting difference between ourselves and many other countries on the separation between the political side and the civil service side. So, civil servants in Canada under the Westminster model don't change when new administrations or governments come in. We serve the government, we recommend to the government, we work with our political colleagues, but at the end of the day, our ability to stay the course and have value add to whatever political direction different governments take, I think is really, really important. And a lot of other countries don't have that, including where I am now, and it's a big challenge where there is no separation between party and state. And so, yeah, those are just some reflections, but thanks for the question.
Gavin, I think now you're probably the furthest away from us, representing Canada in Mozambique in Africa. I have one more critical question to you from your fellow classmate, Michael Smith, class of 2000. And the question is, how do you assess Canada's current international reputation? It feels like we say the right things, but how much impact do we actually have vis-a-vis our relative size?
It's a great question. One of the challenges we face in terms of impact is measurement. right? And as a political officer, unlike perhaps my colleague Lee on the trade side, they're often asked for like indicators and how many meetings did the companies get and what legislation did we get. Measuring how we influence community, person, government to pay more attention to the human rights of women and girls, or to the values in the francophonie, or other things that come up all the time is really tough. So it can only be done, I think, with a measured approach to, again, base ourselves on the networks that we create and the strength of those networks, and then think about where we can try and have the most impact. Not trying to throw in the kitchen sink and do all the priorities all the time. One thing I'm learning over my, I guess, nearly 13-year career in the Foreign Service is I'm getting better at saying no. That we have to choose our partners wisely. It's through our partners that our implementation is most effective, and that when we work with partners who usually have a larger megaphone than us as a government representative in a foreign place, that's when we're most effective. When the people that we're trying to target actually carry our message for us. So like, remember in LA when we were approaching congressmen on Section 232 tariffs and made them realize, oh my gosh, there's tens of thousands of jobs going to suffer for these tariffs. Well, I'm going to take the message, literally the lines that we gave the US congressman and said, hey, you should tweet about this, and having him do it, that's impact.
Thank you, Gavin. And Michael, I hope Gavin answered your question well. If you have any follow-up questions, you can always direct message him. And finally, now, Hussein, I have a question for you. Hussein, in your work as a political counselor to the Permanent Mission of Canada to the United Nations, you are responsible for creating and maintaining relationships that represent the views of an entire country. How do you ensure that positive relationships are formed with international representatives who may represent countries with opposing views to Canada's?
Thanks. Another great question there. So first thing I would mention is that as UCC Model UN folks will know, is a lot of what happens at the UN is actually done by consensus. So it's not that not everything goes up for a vote and there's this many countries for, this many against, because if you look at the 193 member states of the United Nations right now, we probably wouldn't win a lot of those votes. So it's actually in our interest to get a lot of things sorted out in a text that can be adopted by consensus, because there are large blocks that can move that aren't necessarily aligned with our values. And when you operate under that framework of needing to get to consensus, that's when we really, I just respond to one of the questions in the chat. That's where the kind of old school diplomacy plays a part. There's the reason we're here, especially post-pandemic, when we're able to do so much over Zoom. The reason we're here in different places around the world is really building those personal relationships with people who we aren't always going to agree with, and then working closely together to find, okay, where can we align? What kind of language can we agree to? We're going to have red lines on a lot of things, on human rights, on gender equality, where we're not going to, soften up our stance. But we can probably find language that all countries can agree to on a lot of things. So even countries where we're going to disagree on a lot, say Iran. Right now, Iran and Canada have a very similar position in terms of the need for Afghanistan to have ethnic minorities represented in their government. China, you've talked about the complicated relationship there, especially when we had the two Michaels, one of whom was a former colleague of all of ours. China and Canada have a similar stance on reform of the UN Security Council. So we can differ on a lot of areas and then find those areas where we agree. And by having those experiences of working together, you generally find ways, again, through that personal and really most of the time has to be in-person dialogue. You can find ways to come to an agreement on the areas where we have big differences. And one of the other benefits of being in New York at the UN, where every country is represented, it's also a venue for sharing messages in situations where we don't have representation. So, I mentioned Iran, right now Syria, we don't have an embassy there. Saudi Arabia, we don't have an ambassador right now. So there's opportunities here where we do have that direct engagement, where we don't have the official kind of bilateral ties. So that's another advantage of this role. And just to jump on the follow-up question to Gavin in terms of whether or not people are listening to Canada. Right now in New York, we have an ambassador, a guy named Bob Ray. He's not an old boy, but most of you have probably heard of him. And partly because of his political nature, and also just because of the his extensive experience internationally and kind of strong ties domestically, the sense I get here is we are very much listened to, at least in the multilateral world. And we, I think internally in Global Affairs Canada, we often wonder the same question. It's like, okay, are we really making a difference? But you do see it in partner countries. It's, I think one colleague told me it's a lot easier to support a resolution when we know Canada is going to be on the same side as us. So we do play a bit of a rudder in terms of these issues, especially when we can make our mind up early and say, okay, this is the side of the issue we're going to be on. It makes it a lot easier for the EU, others to get together, African nations. We're not like the US, where there's a kind of complicated, superpower and colonial history of European powers. So we do play an important role, certainly in the multilateral context. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Hussein. So now you're at the center of international affairs. I got few similar questions from younger alumni asking if they want a career in international affairs. Is it necessary to obtain a degree in political science or international affairs first to do international work for Canada? Can you answer quickly? Thank you.
Sure, it's a great question, and any of us are able to answer that. It's not a prerequisite. I think every year, it's not as predictable as say like a college application, but every year, maybe every 2 years, there'll be a process called the Foreign Service Recruitment. You go to jobs.gc.ca and you'll see all the government jobs available. This will be kind of one category. It's not required. Most of the time, it's a related degree. Economics counts. But we have colleagues who are engineers, former doctors. It's a whole range. And like Gavin was saying, in general, they value a diversity of experience in terms of what's coming in. The process is not pain-free. It's a long process. It takes a couple of years. You have to have your French up to date. So do spend time on that if you're not in a situation where you get to practice both languages, both kind of Canadian official languages now. But I think it may be worth a separate session on kind of going into the Foreign Service with young alumni down the road, because it's there's lots of ups and downs in terms of the process, and we can spend a bit more time on the pros and cons of moving around and life abroad, which I think you've already got a pretty good flavor of as well.
Thank you, Hussein. While you're speaking, I'm also taking notes myself. So I hope you're ready for the second round of questions. The first one is to Lee, back to your specialty, China. So Lee, in your career, you have had the professional privilege of working hands-on with China on behalf of Canada. It appears that the two countries operate as symbiotic partners that both depend on each other for such functions as trade and immigration, and as well oppose each other on topics such as economic policy and cybersecurity and human rights. In your experience, how have the two countries been able to put aside their differences in order to collaborate on elements that are mutually beneficial when fighting the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, Xu, thanks for the easy question. Now, look, we've been through a very challenging period in the relationship, and personally, I think there's still so much work that needs to be done to address many of those underlying differences. That is going to continue for some time. What we have hopefully learned from the COVID experience is that we're all vulnerable. And while some countries, such as China, have been able to implement measures to mitigate the immediate impact, what is truly required to overcome the challenges at a global scale is transparency and its collaboration. My colleagues, Hussein and Gavin have mentioned that in terms of multilateral efforts. We see that new variants such as Omicron, of course, suggest that the walls erected in the first phase of the pandemic, they're not sustainable. In terms of COVID, yes, there needs to be a discussion, collaboration on supply chains and establishing transparent and responsible platforms to nurture that research and development. You mentioned biomedical IP, of those tools that we need based on a rules-based order to ensure that is most effective. It's based on both market principles and the need of our health situation, and that requires dialogue. It requires collaboration. Looking forward and beyond COVID, I want to say we must, live by these tenets to address so many issues that are facing humanity, from climate change, of course, to the next global health crisis. We really do all have skin in this game, and I think everyone realizes that. Domestically, China is also facing a number of what we call interwoven systemic barriers to stability, such as stimulating the household consumption. I spoke to class at McGill last night and talked a lot about the need for household consumption to make up a greater proportion of GDP to address the unbalanced economy. Agricultural sustainability to ensure that food security for its own people. And then again, in the near term, managing that demographic crisis or risk potentially falling into a middle income trap. And China in a middle income trap, it's a very scary thought. We talked about the UN Security Council and their position there, double digit growth in defense spending. So we need to think about this from a global perspective as well. And really, essentially, China does need to get rich or wealthy before it gets too old to do so. We saw Japan able to do that successfully, but China it's a different beast. 1.4 billion people. There's no real country that can compare in history to some of the challenge it faces. I understand you spent some time at the National Development and Reform Commission while in China. Very interesting. The NDRC we work with very closely is all too aware of these issues. And I think they acknowledge that countries like Canada have experience in these areas. For example, building and establishing a robust and effective pension system that helps to stimulate that confidence towards consumption-led growth. On consumption-led growth and stability of an economy or peoples, you have to have a sense that your future is secure, that your health system is able to buttress what is needed to start spending and to purchase, sustainably, but to make the purchases to adjust an economy to a more stable place. So, of course, Canada is a trading nation. We've always been and always will be very much a proponent of rules-based global governance. And we're eager to see all major economies like China commit to those collaborative multilateral engagement efforts. And that's something that we work with others and like-minded partners and allies every day as we tackle some of these major geopolitical and global economic issues.
Thank you, Lee. That's insight from some expert. I also know you received Mandarin training for 14 months.
Yep.
Hope we can practice some Mandarin together. So Gavin, the next question is to you. Gavin, your studies and professional positions have taken place in both developed and developing nations. With such varied exposure and experience, what differences do you see with regards to how a health crisis such as COVID-19 is managed by such differing government and healthcare infrastructures? What can more developed nations learn from countries such as Mozambique or Senegal?
Thanks, Zhu. When I was looking at the sort of pre-prep for this question, I sort of want to take it a different direction. And Lee's already touched on some of the COVID stuff, but I think the key part of that is exposure and experience, and what I've learned from working in the developing world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Senegal is just as different to the Gambia, its neighbor, as Ontario is to Mongolia. Africa is not a country. Africa is 53 states, or 54, I think, actually, sorry, of totally different histories, people, languages, and it cannot be treated as a whole. That's something I really did learn. And that goes for your question about different governments and healthcare infrastructures and approaches and colonial history and all the things that impact how people are accessed by their government services, or vice versa. And in terms of how COVID's gone in this part of the world, in Southern Africa, I think, and the fact that we didn't see since March 2020 till now, the total collapse that some prognosticators, economists, and the WHO were saying, this is going to be disaster, it's going to be total economic shutdown. There's definitely been struggles. And Canada, amongst other donors, the World Bank and IFIs have done their best to lift up economies through loans and even microloans to individuals, not just to governments, as a way to get through these tough economic times. But I think resiliency is the word that comes to mind when you talk about sub-Saharan African countries generally, but also the huge importance of the youth bulge. Here in Mozambique, I think it's 65% of the population is under 25 or 35, maybe it's 30. It's incredible the demographic differences between this part of the world and other parts of the world. And that's really important, especially when it comes to pandemics, which some of the regions in this part of the world are used to. Vaccines are the major problem now. We just came out of the fourth wave shutdown here, but things are reopening quickly. Just this week, a shipment of Canadian vaccines, the first time any donated Canadian vaccines are arriving in Mozambique, will arrive on Friday through the COVAX facility and Gavi that we've been supporting right from the beginning. In fact, since like April 2020, when I was in New York, that was a major contribution, but it's been slow. There's no getting around it. And the inequality of that distribution of global vaccines has been tough politically to manage in terms of responses. When the president of Malawi goes on CBC television with Rosie Barton and calls out, the West and Canada specifically for not following through on its promises, even though yes, we contribute to Gavi and it's coming, but that's not good enough when in a place like Malawi, only 3% of the population is vaccinated. And so I think the other part I wanted to talk about was how much I've learned in the different places, and specifically here, I learned to work with. But in the States, I learned to talk economics and commercial policy through advocacy and politics. But here, I'm learning to talk about international development in a different way and what it means to be in a country that's a recipient of bilateral aid, to be in countries that are recipients of multilateral and partnership aid with NGOs, and working with colleagues in that space and teaching them about the importance of communication. That was part of the answer that I gave earlier in the chat, was about that we're always getting better at communicating what we're doing. And particularly in the international aid context, we tend to say, Canada is proud to contribute X millions of dollars to this initiative with a really long name that touches on all these, different things. It doesn't get to the heart of the story that we want to tell, which is that Canada is supporting women and girls, education, health, against child marriage, changing lives through the contributions that we make and the hard work that we put in with international partners, NGOs, and the third parties that implement the projects that we come up with. But also the host governments that accept that help, that we're all striving for the same thing. And there's a lot of negativity around corruption and the value of traditional aid programs, all this sort of stuff. We can debate it. But at the end of the day, it is helping raise up the most vulnerable, particularly women and girls, through our feminist international assistance policy, which I'm really proud to talk about in every context that we go into. And we put gender equality and women and girls first in everything that we do. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Gavin. I'm really shocked by the demographic in Africa. That's very interesting. And Hussein, I have one more question for you. With such a wide exposure and deep understanding of some of the most polarizing geopolitical situations that our world faces today, from political instability in Afghanistan to racial and ethnic division and diversity in Myanmar, what's your insight on the ability for a government to serve the healthcare needs of its citizens when in a state of unrest? How have other countries such as Canada been able to support and assist those in need of basic care? Thank you.
Thanks, G. And I'll build on a bit of what Gavin was saying. I think we had Canada had an experience with COVID that reminded us that no country can deal with some of these, some of the world's new most pressing challenges alone, right? In the early days, we could, Lee, I remember, was frantically working with US contacts to get vaccines to Canada. There were PPE contracts with China. So even a country like Canada with, GDP per capita were solid, fairly cohesive, relationship with the provinces. We had a hard time at the start, but then once we had those inputs, we were able to get to a point where we're among the most vaccinated populations in the world. Not everyone is there yet, and I think there was a talk from Peter Singer, another old boy who knows this issue much better than any of us, a couple of weeks ago. But we've now realized that our own safety is now contingent on the health of other countries. We've seen the variants emerge all over the world, and we're only truly going to be safe as we get more first shots into arms, be it in Mozambique or be it in Ottawa. More that's going to keep us safer than kind of more fourth shots. So Canada did play a leadership role in standing up this facility in Geneva called COVAX. That really was the mechanism through which we were able to get a lot of vaccine out to the rest of the world. Hasn't done enough, if you ask Peter Singer and if you ask me, but we are kind of ramping up that effort. But I think us and others around the world need to do more. Systems in Myanmar are not perfect. I think they've got layered on top of issues that we face in Canada. There's further issues in terms of ethnic divisions and who's accessing the vaccine and power. And then there's also respond to one of the questions in the chat. China's playing a role, trying to curry influence with the leaders of country by they got vaccine to leaders of most of the developing world, not the populations, but to the presidents, prime ministers, people around them very early. We're now seeing that it's not quite as effective as some other vaccines, but that did buy some influence. And in response to the question, we are seeing the rules of the game changed by default, just by the way this now emerged superpower is acting. So COVID has really brought to light a number of things that we can't do anything alone. We do need to work together. We don't necessarily have the governance mechanisms to make these work. And when push comes to shove, we do take care of ourselves first, but we need to make sure we're also building systems to keep everybody healthy. So which is also in our self-interest, not only in the interest of kind of global health there.
Thank you, Hussein. Being cautious with the time, I have one final question that I would like to ask everyone to use 1 minute to answer individually. COVID-19 aside, how do you see Canada playing a strategic role on the global stage for a better future for us all? And what is Canada doing today that we can all be proud of? Let's start with Lee, Hussein, and then Gavin.
Thanks, Xu. I'll try to be brief. I think I just want to sort of pull a little bit very quickly from Hussein's last comments and Gavin's as well. I think, and also that question, which is a good one in terms of China and Russia and non-Western powers. Ultimately, what we're going into, and we're seeing, as we have said, walls created to engagement. And I'll be honest and direct, China prefers to work bilaterally. There's an impetus to do so versus multilaterally, especially when you're a big player. Countries like Canada, we're a middle power, and we need to understand that. We need to we have to respect that to some extent, because we can't expect to punch above that. However, in terms of as we look to rebuild the global economy and reinvest in sustainable, hard social infrastructure that's required, and multilateral engagement and that rules-based global order, it's paramount. Canada, of course, we're reliant on that strong global fabric. We're reliant on fair and transparent trading regime. So for this reason, Canada does bring a consistent, never-ending imperative to global discourse, working to secure that system, to address inequities, to combat issues such as forced labor, and again, to support climate financing, public-private partnerships, and strengthen the voice of underrepresented segments of all of global economy, because it is in our best interest. And we have to realize what's in our best interest is what we will work strongest for. So I think from that perspective, we bring and maintain that dialogue when it's most needed as we go through this challenging period.
Thank you, Lee. Hussein?
Sure. I'll point to two things that I think we can all be very proud of. One, Canadian governments, regardless of political stripe, have really recognized the outsized impact of investing in women and girls, both for health and education purposes, as the biggest contributor to future wealth and future growth in a country. We saw with the maternal newborn child health initiative under Harper, and now, Gavin referred to the Feminist International Assistance Policy. Canada has been a real leader on this, and in Washington, I saw the way we shaped the way the World Bank and IMF think about their programming, and here in New York, we've influenced the UN. So we do punch above our weight, as Lee said, as a middle power, by using those values, pushing them into the system, and having outsized impact there. So I think that's something we can all be proud of. Second, and this is more the Canadian population, not the government, I think the response to major crises around the world, be it Syria a number of years ago, be it Afghanistan recently, the response in particular in accepting refugees, if you take away the neighboring countries where people literally kind of flee into, Canada accepts more refugees per capita than anyone else in the world. And it's something we can all be proud of. And I know the college has played a role in terms of educating some of the children of these refugees. So it's pretty amazing to be able to tell that story in places around the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Hussein. Gavin?
I guess I'll just close by sort of what we've all said is that what are the tools that Canada has at its disposal? We don't have the same leverage that larger countries do in terms of pressures and that sort of thing. We do have some, but for my work on the political side, advocating on human rights issues, I think that our values is what translates to change. Our values, yes, there is also value in the dollars and cents we put into international development, and that creates some leverage. But at the end of the day, it's the repetition of our messages about diversity, about feminism, about equality that actually do shift. And it's not, again, going back to that initial question, it's not quick wins. It's less measurable. And it is a struggle. We're getting better at communicating where we do have success. But just even a session like this is a good advocacy tool. And I've done a bunch of these with civil society organizations here in Mozambique, Zoom sessions in Portuguese, talking about media freedom, for example, and what Canada believes through the Media Freedom Coalition and protection of journalists and human rights defenders. And that has impact. And having host governments, stakeholders, civil society, influencers hear those messages is important, and we're proud to do it. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you. So that's all our questions, and this wraps up the formal portion of our event. Thank you very much for everyone's participation, and my sincere thanks to today's speakers, Lee, Hussein, and Gavin, for sharing your expertise and perspective. I think we all learned a lot. Before we go, Christina Schreiber from the advancement team would like to say a few words. Christina, please.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many alumni, parents, colleagues, and students sign on today. This series is all about community connections and diverse perspectives, and we appreciate everyone's participation in the presentation and in the chat today. Next week, we'll have an opportunity to learn about dynamic communications with UCC alumni Trevor Curry from the class of 1989. Trevor is the author of Move the Room, a book about practical communications, and he will share some of his best practices that can help you instantly elevate and amplify your message to any audience. Samantha has put the link in the chat, and you can also keep an eye on your inbox for more registration information. If you'd like today's presentation, you can show your support for UCC's mission to provide transformational learning with a charitable donation to the UCC Annual Fund. Your donation helps UCC to support students through investments in technology, well-being, and financial assistance. Every gift is meaningful and can be easily made online, also through a link in the chat. So I know the speakers will be hanging around for a few moments following today's presentation. And if there are any additional questions, I know that they would be happy to engage following the formal presentation. Thank you so much to our speakers for bringing all of your expertise to this conversation today. And I know that our entire UCC community is very appreciative. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.